and welcome back to the Purple Cloud podcast. Today we have a great guest and a friend of mine, Michael Brown, who has just finished translating his most recent book, the second installment of Explanations of Channels and Points, Volume 2, also edited by Alan Saw. And for those of you who don't know, it is a Qing dynasty acupuncture commentary by Yue Hanzhen. And in the following discussion, we have a pretty lively talk on many topics, such as what attracted him to the book and what makes this book so special in Chinese medical history. And we also talk a little bit about our views on the education of Chinese medicine today. The book is currently available for order through Purple Cloud Press and can be ordered through our website at www.purplecloudinstitute.com. So, without further ado, let's get into the interview. Okay, welcome back to the Purple Cloud podcast. And I have special guest today, Michael Brown, friend of mine in Queensland, Brisbane in Australia, also in lockdown right now. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Daniel. I'll also say you're in lockdown as well.
I certainly am.
I'll just say this: 4 p.m. today. Apparently, I think our lockdown would be lifted, but it's in quite a fragile state. The three major cities of Australia, I think they're kind of going in and out of lockdown relatively quickly. So we'll see. I hope we can maintain.
We've been more in than out lately in Sydney, but yeah, that's life. And you've recently published your second volume of the Explanation of Channels and Points by Yue Hanzhen.
It's not quite out yet. Maybe by the time this is posted, it should be out.
Yeah.
We're just waiting on a little bit of typesetting, just fixing a few things, making sure that none of my errors get through to the final publication.
Yeah. You've got a good team working on that.
I feel I'm incredibly lucky to have put the team together. Like that I work with, and then with what Johan, who's our the publisher at Purple Cloud, has put together as well. And I guess it's also luck, but it's also a little bit of I kind of like look at it as a little bit of maybe hard work and maybe a little bit of fate. Or how do you say, like Yue Hanzhen, right?
Yeah, Yue Hanzhen, yeah, sure.
Yue Hanzhen. Because like Alan Saw, he's my editor for my work. And like we'd never met in real life before. We'd only interacted online, but I sent him over I think in like 2018 or maybe early 19. I can't remember exactly when, a draft of the lung channel, and he was equally fascinated with the material as I was, and so he decided to kind of come on and help me edit it as well.
And this was volume 1.
Yeah, this was for volume 1, and it's just kind of, if I hadn't done that work to do a draft, to have something sent to him, then the chances of us working together would have probably not have happened. But then there's also that kind of like that Yue Hanzhen, that kind of destiny, fate of me kind of reaching out to someone online who I'd only ever kind of spoken to a few times, saying, hey, like obviously I could see by his work and what he posted on Facebook groups that he was a good scholar, understood the language very well, knew the history. And I thought, this is someone that I would want to work with. And since that time, we've worked on, this is our third project that we've worked together between our editing and translating. And he's also worked with Johan on a few projects as well. So he's really working with quite a few people. And I think and myself and Alan are also working on or helping edit Will Serval's latest book as well, which is on the Chow vessels, which I think it's called The Archaeology of the Chow Vessels.
Yeah, we're hoping to get him on the podcast in the future when it's closer to the release date. Yeah.
That's a seriously cool work as well that I'm I've kind of seen it start from the very beginning with Will, and seeing it. I think it was just going to be like a little bit of an article, and then he started turning it into a book, and it's kind of really, really cool to see how it's morphed and gotten bigger and bigger, and just seeing all the changes. And it's a lot of work, but I think it's that book is really going to raise the scholarship of Chinese medicine in the West. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's overall, I think Purple Cloud Press is really doing great things for Chinese medicine publishing, translation, and I'm really excited to see like what else they do in the future as well, because it's I think it's an exciting time. What do you think about
I mean, I do, because I think when I started studying, I think I talked to Alan about this, but when I started studying, I couldn't speak Chinese, and there really wasn't much out there. Like there were a handful of books you kind of needed to buy as a Chinese medicine student. I think this would have been around 2005 or something, but really you didn't have the sort of, you didn't get the idea of there was 2000 years of literature written about everything on every topics, and that there was debate on topics, and the concepts had evolved in different ways. And the way you were taught in universities was that these are the formulas you learn, and these are how you use them, and that's that, and no idea of where they came from in Chinese medical history. And later on you start looking into it, and okay, this one's formulas from the 1950s, and this one's from the Han Dynasty, and okay, what's going on there? So I think there's much more awareness, more dialogue now in the community, and more of these, I'm not going to say obscure, but more of these not classical works, like non-classics, so they're not a Qing, are starting to emerge. People like the history of opinions. So it's coming through Purple Cloud, but other people are, publishing themselves as well, and I think it's great. Yeah.
Look, I agree, 100% with kind of what you said when you were studying, and that was my experience studying Chinese medicine. At first I didn't learn Chinese, and I remember being in like my final year, and someone sort of said, oh, you got to check out applied channel theory. I was like, oh well, why? And they're just like, oh, it's such a great book. And so anyway, I bought it, and I read it in like a couple of weeks, and I was just like, wow, man, this is, because it was such a beautiful melding of kind of like classical Chinese thought with modern applications, I think, as well. And it really felt like something like a book that I'd been looking to read for my whole kind of Chinese medicine education as well. So I always tell students, if you want to be kind of a good acupuncturist, you've got to read that book, because there's not really anything else like it in the West. And that's what and that's kind of what I think you want to look for in books, is something kind of unique as well. And and in terms of like kind of like literature, when I was studying, there wasn't that much. There was a lot of stuff that just kind of didn't really have that uniqueness about it. Was maybe like, I wouldn't want to say like superficial, but kind of didn't go to the depths that you would get in Chinese language texts, I guess, as well. Whereas applied channel theory, you got the theory, you got to see the mind of the author working, his thinking as well, and that was really cool.
Yeah, that was I think one of the books that really made an impact on me early. And that's when I went to Beijing. I was like, oh, I have to study with Wang Zhuyi, and I got those opportunities because it was like, that was the book that it was different to everything else that was out there at the time. And it does bring those classical ideas and quoting from various classical things into a modern clinical scope. And that's not what I was being taught at university at all. Let's. Oh, did you? Sorry,
no, you go.
I wanted to rewind a bit and get into why you've chosen to translate these books, because you've not done one. This is number 2, so clearly this is something. When you came across it, it was something that was quite meaningful to you. You found that it was something quite special. So I'm quite curious why you pick these works to start to translate?
I think there's a couple of things that you need to think about when you're going to start a project. You know, one I would say is kind of like, do you think that it's going to be an important work in the West? At least, kind of in talking about maybe like a translation or writing something in Chinese medicine. So I think one of the key questions is, do you think it's going to be an important work? And looking at explanations of channels and points, I really thought that yes, this would be an important work. And first off, the reason for that is that I was looking at it and it's written, I think Alan and I have looked at the dates and it's something like 1680 to 1690. So kind of, 330, 40 years ago, something like that. But just the first time that I opened it, I noticed that he numbered all the points,
Mm.
and like we think that that's a modern invention. We definitely aren't ever told that someone over 300 years ago has numbered all the points. And
Is that the first instance you've come across of the points being numbered?
From beginning to end, yes.
Okay.
There are what I would call some implicit numberings. So in the large intestine, you have like jian, sanjian, so
sure.
second and third space, right?
Yeah,
on
sure.
the bladder channel, I think you have wu chu, or like fifth location, fifth place on the head. So there are actually those. I think that's the only instances that I can remember where they use numbers that align with the point numbers in the names.
Mm-hmm.
So were those enough to kind of say, oh, hey, I should number these points? Possibly. I think there are other times I haven't seen them number the points, but what I have seen is they might say something like there were in total like 46 points on this channel on both sides, or something like that. At the end of a channel in some of the old books, they might say in total there is this X amount of number of points, but they don't individually. I haven't seen anyone else individually number the points before this guy. So that was the first thing that kind of stuck out to me, is like, here's this guy kind of like 300 years ahead of his time that wants to make it easier for us foreigners so we don't have to learn the names. not that he would have thought that, no. But I just thought that's really cool. And then I kind of like, I was having a little bit of a brief look through it, and I remember scrolling to about lung 5 or Chesa, and he starts kind of talking about, well, he breaks down diseases in a lot of the old acupuncture texts, like whether it be the systematic classic or from Sun Tzu Miao's kind of Tianjin Yafangs, or the thousand gold pieces or ducat, however you wish to translate that, in the Wai Tai Miao, which I think is like the arcane essentials of the Imperial Library, something like that. And they just list long indication lists for each point. And it's kind of like, well, how do you use that? Are you just supposed to remember kind of like distension in the lungs, sorrow and crying, pain in the arm, maybe like like scantness of breath? How are you supposed to memorize and utilize these long lists of indications? And so this is probably the next big advancement that I found in this text, is that he actually breaks it down into certain patterns. So for like a lung point, he might say that these are kind of like lung indications of this point. These are heart indications of these points. These are lung indications for this point as well. So when you're looking through like a point like lung 5, you can see, oh, it treats the heart in this way, it treats the lung in this way, it treats the spleen in this way, or the liver or the kidney, and things like that. And what I found kind of even cooler than that was not just that breakdown, but then he'll say, oh, like it's one of the points in the lung channel, but he'll say like for frequent urination, this lung point treats that because the lung is the mother of the kidneys as well. So then he's kind of bringing in this 5-phase relationship. Or sometimes he'll say something like, oh, you want to treat the fire point on the metal channel as well. So he's kind of bringing in, I think they something call it like the mutual interaction of the 5 phases, like Wu Xing Hu Xiang, something like that, where they kind of like look at the phase within the phase as well, like the fire of metal or the metal of metal and things like that. And even in modern texts, you don't really see people talk about 5-phase acupuncture like that. So that was kind of this other reason that I thought was just incredible. He's really talking about not just the diseases, but trying to explain them, about how to use the points. And for me, that was very, very unique. I hadn't seen, and I still haven't found any other acupuncture text up until maybe the last kind of 50 or 60 years, where there's been much more proliferation of materials on acupuncture, especially out of China, something like that, who would commentate on every acupuncture name and point and kind of indication.
Yeah, right. And how has it influenced your clinical practice?
I think
Because
I think
you've
for me,
delved in really deep. I'm sure you've absorbed some of this and tried a few of these sort of things out. Yeah.
look, I definitely feel that there's still has to have like a more impact on my practice. Um, it's a very, very heavy text, and I guess kind of one of the ways I still think you don't want to necessarily memorize the text, but it's kind of more maybe used as a little bit like a reference text. You've been using maybe like lung 5 or lung 9 or stomach 36, something like that, and you go and then you think, well, maybe I can go and look this up and see what other uses I can find from this point as well, and try and use it like that as well, because I think it's too much to memorize. But if you can kind of, if you've been using a point, it might be nice to go back and look at it, and maybe look at the surrounding points. Or alternatively, if you have a difficult or you have a strange kind of condition, you might think, I don't know what points treat that as well, because we are more often now taught point function than kind of point indications as well, which is also kind of a 20th century development as well, is teaching point functions rather than point indications. Is that what you've kind of felt like as well?
Um, I've definitely not delved into that text as much as you have, but yes, the indications and the functions to me, I've noticed it kind of, if you're only familiar with that, it's like people approach an acupuncture point like a button or something, like you
Mm,
flick a switch and it will do all these
mm,
things magically in the body.
mm.
And I don't think it actually necessarily works like that. You've got
Well,
to, there's a lot more that goes on. You know, it doesn't magically connect immediately to an organ and you press the
mm.
button and it'll magically do all these things to the organ. I think there's more going on than that.
Well, if we were to look at it in one way, if you look at released exterior herbs, you might have guija and mahuang. Now, yes, they're sometimes used together, sometimes they're used apart, but they're absolutely not mutually interchangeable.
Yeah, sure.
So if you kind of like look at maybe like, everyone says spleen 9 resolves damp, but maybe one of the future things, like I haven't done this, but it would be interesting to kind of go through and look at, well, what does that mean to resolve damp in terms of that point? Where are you resolving the damp? Is it kind of dampness of the four limbs, or dampness in the stomach and spleen, in the center as well? you know Uh, so you can't necessarily just say, I want to resolve damp, I'm going to choose this point, and then perhaps not be surprised if your clinical outcome is not as effective as you would have liked.
Mm. I'm personally quite big on palpation as well. So if I don't find an issue particularly in that area or that channel, like I'm not going to think that if I put a needle in that point, it's going to have some massive systemic effect on damp or whatever. Like
Mm.
my training's been very big on looking and seeing, the patient and using theory, but not getting too caught up in theory. Grounding it in reality as well.
Well,
Yeah.
then I think that's kind of the idea of applying that theory in a practical means as well. And I kind of like, I always go back to think about the opening line of the Lunyu, or the Analects, where it's kind of like, to study and practice is that's happiness.
Mm.
So it's kind of like, like when you're doing the palpation and things like that, you're still looking, I guess, for an observable means of diagnosis that will kind of inform what you're going to do next.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, maybe that's not for everyone. Maybe some people just prefer to use indications as well. That's
Sure.
fine. but I guess kind of like what I would like to see is people, and even not just using my book. I think that the manual of acupuncture is actually one of the greatest texts that has like songs or combinations for acupuncture points as well.
Mm,
So it's kind of like, when I would read some case studies in Chinese, that like the thing that seemed to stood out to me the most was that they would seem to memorize or put in some line from a classical text or a song or something like this. They say, I saw this in a patient, and so I thought maybe, like geez, I'll use, like they say, like this is from the, I think, the Ishui Rumen, or like kind of entering the door of the Chinese medicine, something like that. And like for stomach 40 and Zhongwan for like phlegm as well. So they say I saw this, and so I remembered this from this text and I used it as well. So you kind of, how to say, you're and this is what I think what Chinese medicine is for me, is about using like your sources to inform your treatment as well. And maybe it's something that you learned from your teacher, or more of a modern text, or more of a classical text, but you're kind of able to have that link in your mind about what you're doing.
mm. And is this one of the reasons you think it's so important to translate these works into English, like these older Chinese texts? I'm curious because you're quite passionate about this, so I'd like to hear your take on these translations and why you feel they're so important.
Look, honestly, if I was here now and I just finished the second volume and I was just starting out, I would say, Michael, don't do it. You don't know what you're in for. Just get out now while you're ahead. Go do something else. Because it was a tough 4 years, to translate, to edit as well. It's a lot of work. Like there are times when we're looking at a section, you're looking at the text, you compare it to the text in the Genju Dachang, or the complete compendium of acupuncture and moxibustion, and then you compare it back to what's in the Su Wen or the Ling Shu, like the inner canon, and you're just looking for errors in the text and stuff like that, and you're not even translating yet. You're just trying to see if there are errors. So you're not just translating, you're doing textual research as well. But in terms of importance, I really think that like there are so many Chinese medical texts. So I think when you pick a text that you want to translate, you want something that will be useful to people, and that they'll be able to kind of like go back and continually use and find something out of. And I think that's why Explanations of Channels and Points is such a good book, is that there's so much information in it. Like the first volume is just the first 7 channels, and it's 470 pages. The second volume is the next 5 primary channels, and then the two, the Ren and the Du, and then the small passages on the other 6 extraordinary channels. I think we're clocking in at nearly 500 pages. You know, there's that amount of material on acupuncture and points, written before 1911. Very unlikely to find another book or text like that as well. And I also think that when at least when I read it, Yue Hanzhen is a very astute scholar, and he explains the names in some very kind of beautiful, poetic ways. He explains the characters, and then even in that way, you perhaps begin to understand the points a little bit better as well, rather than just allocating them a channel and a number. Uh, so for me, I guess the other important thing I think within Chinese medicine is that, for myself, I spent 3 years learning Chinese language, and actually another year then doing honors and studying classical. Is that like, I have the ability, with the help of my friends, to translate material for others, which I believe which will make Chinese medicine better. So if I have that ability, then I feel like I should do that and contribute to the medicine as well. Because when I've read and gone through other texts, all the kind of early like Ming, Qing authors and things like that, you want to improve the medicine for the people that come after you as well. When we were talking about applied channel theory, that book left a really deep impression on me. And so hopefully my works can leave a deep impression on other people and can perhaps inspire them to learn Chinese and think, hey, if this guy can translate this stuff, then so can I as well. And hopefully we can help improve Chinese medicine for everyone. We can get kind of perhaps not just learn superficialness, but dive deeper into these texts, try and understand the thoughts and the minds of these people who were writing these texts, and really just try and how to say elevate Chinese medicine for everyone. Because I think, when we elevate the practice of Chinese medicine, or if you yourself elevate the practice of Chinese medicine, that just doesn't benefit you. That benefits all Chinese medicine practitioners, because it is very unlikely in at least in the West, where someone goes and sees a Chinese medicine practitioner. If it doesn't work, they will say Chinese medicine doesn't work. If they go see a doctor and the medication doesn't work, they won't say, oh, Western medicine doesn't work. No, in Chinese medicine, we're almost representatives of the medicine as we practice it. And if it doesn't work, then the person will perhaps blame the medicine rather than the practitioner. So if we can improve the maybe like how do you say treatment outcomes for all practitioners, then I think that helps improve the standing of Chinese medicine in the community as well, and that really benefits everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right. What you were talking about reminded me a bit of when I interviewed Volker Scheid a few months back, and he was saying he felt that Chinese medicine in the West has entered a more, at least its teenage years. It's no longer in its infancy. And I think what you're speaking to is a bit of that it's branched off, and it's kind of in the West, it's more able to stand on its 2 feet. And we don't always need to keep looking to China or in the East, and that there is something developing in the West that is, yeah, more developed and more mature. What I really liked about the most recent volume, the second volume, which I found interesting, was the inclusion of the 8 extraordinary vessels. We touched a little bit on the education in the West, and remember listening to you at the ACMAC, which is the Australian Acupuncture Chinese Medicine Association conference in Melbourne in 2008.
2019.
19, 18 or 19? Probably 19,
No,
I think.
2019, because 2018 was Sydney.
Okay, there you go. You're right. There you go.
Yep.
I think you spoke on the same topic in both, from memory.
Similar topics.
Similar.
I think I spoke a little bit different one about source-based medicine in Melbourne.
Okay, and that was your big thing is source-based medicine, and I think one of the biggest areas where that doesn't happen in the West is the topic of the extraordinary vessels, where often people add a lot of ideas to them about them being spiritual or very psycho-emotional or all these kinds of things. And often the textual information in China doesn't align with that. And there's quite a bit of detail in your text. One of the interesting things I found was we're taught in school, extraordinary vessels use confluent points to treat them. They have their own history. They're not really mentioned in your book, the book you've translated at all, I don't think. Is that right?
I see them briefly mentioned. It might be either like on the Sanjiao 5 and maybe Gallbladder, but he doesn't seem to make a big deal about them.
No, there's other treatment methods given for the extraordinary channels that are beyond this. So it at least adds to this literature. But I'd love you to talk a little bit on this topic, because it's interesting and something that needs a bit of clearing up, I think.
Well, I think perhaps there's 2 topics. One is first like the education and information surrounding the 8 extras, and then the second would be about this text and the 8 extras.
Sure.
So maybe I'll talk about the first topic first. But I think that one, the 8 extras is probably just the most representative of this problem in the West, and that is that as we go through our Chinese medicine education, where, for example, we're taught the heart governs the shen. That's what we're given that, right? But what we aren't taught is that that line perhaps comes from, you might say Su Wen chapter 8, where, the heart is the kind of, what do you say, like monarch or emperor, and the Shen Ming emanates from it, or this kind of the spirit clarity or clarity of spirit, however you want to say, emanates from it, right? So rather than teaching the quote where it comes from, we're just given a paraphrase, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that sets a very, very dangerous precedent. Why? Because we're no longer looking to original sources to confirm our beliefs about Chinese medicine. And so when we don't do that, then people get to say whatever they please, and we don't hold them to a high standard because we haven't been taught that in school. Now, if someone was to stand up and say, I don't know, something in physics, like, um, like water is like H5O, everyone would laugh at them because we know for 100% that isn't true because we get taught, it's H2O, whatever. And anyone who says something like that, if they wanted to say or put out such a different hypothesis, they would have to prove it. So when people are putting out different hypotheses in Chinese medicine, I don't think that we necessarily in the West hold them to this high standard of scholarship. Whereas, and perhaps it's because we don't have access to these texts, we haven't seen these discussions of ideas as well, or we're not taught them through school. I think that it could be any one of these ideas as well. Or perhaps, I mean, the other idea as well is that people also like this idea that Chinese medicine was a really psycho-spiritual medicine, and that was its, how to say, what it pioneered as well. And I mean, don't get me wrong, like when you look through like compendium of treatment books, there are sections on the spirit, but it's not like this kind of like, it's not like there are whole books on it. You will always like, you might have like a chapter on the spirit, but then there'll probably be diseases like forgetfulness, palpitations, insomnia, so kind of like things like that, actual practical applications of what we might say like problems with the spirit. But it will always be surrounded by things perhaps like glomus or chest pain, or how to say, maybe like impediment B syndrome. It's always within tangible ideas. So when we look at these ideas that I think a lot of these people touting the 8 extras are, when they put them up, we need to really critically analyze and evaluate them and say, hey, how did you arrive at that idea? And I'm absolutely for what I would call extrapolation of Chinese medicine, where you might say, okay, like I'm arriving at this idea because maybe because this classic quoted this statement, and that's how I interpret it. That's fine. And I think that's what they've done in Chinese medicine for the last 2000 years. Lots of people have extrapolated and interpreted the classics. The problem is when you just arrive at D, but you don't have any extrapolation from a classic, or you've just come up with this idea, or someone has told you something in passing and you haven't done the textual research. That, to me, I feel it's on very shaky ground, and I don't know if it, how to say, like is upholding the level of Chinese scholarship that was in the past as well. So I think that we do need to critically analyze and evaluate some of these ideas, and just, it doesn't mean that they can't do them, but I think we need to be careful about whether or not we might include them under the banner of Chinese medicine, when Chinese medicine has such a rich tradition of treating things in its own way as well.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted something very important, is being very clear on where ideas come from. And I've got nothing against personal experience or clinical experience, but if you're teaching someone, I think it's a responsibility to be clear on, yeah, where things come from. Because I have seen, like, you see these charts out there where I have no idea where they're getting these. They're often highly psychologized, I find. So a lot of
Mm.
things brought in from Western psychology. but they're not clear on that, and they present them. I think it's a little disingenuous because by putting them into something like, say, the five elements,
Mm.
there's an idea that these sorts of ideas might have a very long history when in fact they don't, and
Yep.
there's a lot of things implicit in there that might not necessarily be the case. So I think, yeah, you've highlighted something that's quite
Uh,
important.
so now on the second part, which was discussing this book and the eight extras. Um, this was what I noticed with the text, and this is kind of when I was going back and talking about doing textual research. It was it was a lot of textual research in this eight extras part, where because when let me just think about how I will say this. Sorry. The majority of the text appears to be fairly similar to the Qing by my cow, or an exposition on the eight extraordinary vessels, which has been translated, and it seems to be quite similar to that, except that I think in the Qing by my cow they have more discussion of herbs. The herbal discussion doesn't appear in these versions. Um, but what's interesting is, as you were saying, is that they provide quite detailed pathways, and also which makes you think that, like and what you also highlighted before in the West is that we're all about the confluent points as well. Like if you want to treat the Ren vessel, you need to do lung 7, or you want to treat like one of the young child vessel or something like that, well, you can do bladder 62. But actually there are a whole bunch of these points that open and intersect at the young child vessel as well. So you can actually have an influence on those vessels if that's what you're into, by treating these different points. And even I was looking at large intestine 15 and 16 yesterday, and they're both meetings of the young child vessel as well. And I think, I'm not sure that you might do this, but you certainly could. Is large intestine 15, I think, treats like a urination syndrome as well. And I mean, it's definitely not a point that I would ever think of using for a type of urinary problem. But he says, Yue Hanzhen says that this is because the young child vessel meets at that point. And so why might that treat a urinary syndrome? Because the beginning of the young child vessel is on bladder 62. So he kind of gives you this roundabout way of linking the extraordinary vessels as well, which is, and that's kind of an interesting idea of extrapolation as well. And I don't mind that. It's probably not what I would choose to treat or how I would look at it, but I mean, it's kind of this interesting theory behind it. But the eight extraordinary vessels, I think, and the person who wrote the foreword, Henry McCann, he also sort of found it quite interesting to see, and hoping that these writings on the extraordinary vessels might hold some of these other ideas a little bit more to account as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see how people apply it as well, and see whether or not maybe we start thinking about other points rather than just the confluent points in treating the eight extraordinary vessels.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm wondering if I think there are two camps in Chinese medicine. But do you find people who hear these ideas from you, they're generally quite open, because it's a willingness to change, right? The education and the materials that are available have, we've already said, increased greatly. People have certain ideas in their head about what Chinese medicine is, how it treats, and it might work very well clinically for them. When presented with this kind of information and the kind of things you were talking about at ACMAC, how do you find people have responded? Are they
Yes,
open to change? Perhaps, like, this new information you presented may be, different to what they've been doing or what they're used to, or possibly, what they believe quite deeply. So, yeah, I'm curious how people have responded.
I think it, it's definitely, that's a really good question, and I think you're not going to be able to change everyone. But I also think that it depends maybe where they are, how open they are to change. I guess one of the things that I would like to see is that if we go back to that, the heart governing the Shen, I would love people to just be able to have some quotes from the Su Wen that they can just memorize in their head. And, maybe someone comes in with a Shen problem and they think, oh, yeah, I'm going to think of this quote. And it might not be a big deal. But to me, if you're doing that, you're thinking of the Su Wen, you're kind of bringing yourself back into that tradition of Chinese medicine as well. And I think like a lot of people do want to understand where Chinese medicine came from as well, because I think that we do get sometimes presented these ideas and we're not really sure about everything as well. And we're not sure, well, who said this? And I think that's important why we should quote it, because the other idea is that not everything, or sometimes people say something and the context is highly important as well. So you kind of got to understand people's biases as well. What was like the other work that Alan and I did was Zhang Jiebin. Like, what is his bias as well? The man loves, Shu Di Huang.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to tonify Yang by using kind of like warm sweet, like, oh, so like a yin herb that has been cooked as well. So he's engendering Yang by kind of making yin, right? So it's this idea of turning yin into yang as well. So, we might have to be aware of that when we read his work and his biases. And, conversely, when we would look at works like Lu Wansu or Zhu Danxi, who Zhang Jiebin really didn't like, they were all about kind of clearing heat or nourishing yin. So it's kind of like if you're able to explain the importance of understanding these sources and understanding quotes and their context, then I think that people begin to appreciate this idea of source-based Chinese medicine as well. And they realize, they actually think, oh yeah, I do maybe need to be careful about it. Or sometimes, I don't know if you've ever seen it, someone might come up to you and they have this statement, like they just say, oh, this is what this is. And it's like, well, okay, who said that? In what context were they saying it? And is it always, how to say, is it always important or is it always true? You know, because sometimes, like, there was a big debate about whether or not like Chai Hu plunders yin on scholars as well. And it's definitely not a topic that because Ye Tianshi said it as well. But then you might need to consider, is that always a true statement? When was he saying that? Was he talking about it in a specific case of like maybe vacuity taxation or something like that? That this is, you should be cautious of Chai Hu plundering yin, not that it does plunder yin as well. I'm not making an authoritative statement on that topic because I don't know, but I just thought that would be something interesting to look at. So, I think the other camp as well is that there are people who are very interested in perhaps doing trials for Chinese medicine as well. And while, you know, that doesn't interest me at all, I think, unfortunately, well, or fortunately, however you might want to look at it, is that they are actually an important part for Chinese medicine going forward. Is that, unfortunately, we do have to prove ourselves to the Western world that Chinese medicine does work. But the thing is, if we in Chinese medicine should work if it's applied at the right time, in the right place, in the right manner. So we kind of know that. And I think that's kind of what these trials are just telling us as well, is that if you might have a trial with like four major kind of client groups, and if you and maybe you don't modify the formulas or the points, and X amount of patients, they fit that pattern perfectly or relatively well, they get better. But perhaps, if you were in your own clinic, you might slightly tweak the formula or something like that, but you can't do that because it's in a clinical trial and you must adhere to certain standards. And so that perhaps that person doesn't do as well. Well, anyone with Chinese medicine theory will be able to tell you that as well. I mean, there's also the chance that maybe Chinese medicine wouldn't work for that patient. And of course, Chinese medicine can't cure everyone, but I still think, perhaps, if we were able to modify it or something like that, we'll be able to alleviate it. So I guess, I'm not against kind of Chinese medicine going forward with clinical trials and things like that. But what I would argue is that for these people doing trials, we want to make sure that they understand the medicine very well. Otherwise, like, you don't want someone who isn't so good at Chinese medicine doing a clinical trial, because then how can we have faith in that clinical trial if it's not executed well? You don't ask a plumber to come in and wire your house with electricity, right?
Well, this is I see a bit of that happening in the West. Unfortunately, is it's people who get It's the way the university system functions here, but people finish their degree, do a master's, do a PhD, and that's research based, but they've never spent much time in clinic. And because they have a master's and a PhD, they get a job teaching at the uni without a lot of clinical experience. And I've seen a bit of that in the West, which I think is an issue because they're the people who are training the next generation, and their perspective is one of basically uh, Western biomedical
Mm,
experimentation, which is
mm,
quite different. Um, that was a bit of a tangent, but you mentioned you mentioned before as well, like knowing the context of everything. And that's
mm,
something I really did in China. We had classes on the history, and you just when you're taught when I was taught in the West, like I said, you get taught one formula from the 1960s and the
mm,
Zhang Zhongqing formula
mm.
from 2000 years ago, and they're presented in the same context, and you really come out, I find, quite confused. And why are you using certain herbs in
Mm.
this one and other ones in this one? And then, like you said, you realize people have styles and prefer to use certain herbs, different time periods, different areas of China, all of these sorts of things. They all need to be taken into account.
Really,
Yeah.
really, what I would like to see is, rather than for like a formula class, is that you just like you can't just, I think, like you said, learn the formula. You really want to understand the rationale behind the formula as well. For example, if you learn Buzhong Ichitang, learn a little bit about Li Dongyuan. Why was he selecting the herbs that he used? You know, or for example, Sang Juin or Yin Chao San, learn a little bit about the Wenbing Tiabian. Why did Wu Tong choose those formulas instead of like Gui Tang or Ma Xing Tang, something like that? Why is he coming up with his own ideas when we already have these previous formulas? And I think if you read the Wenbing Tiaobian, he kind of delineates his differences about those formulas as well. And so I think that is quite something that is just missing in the West, is understanding these ideas as well. And perhaps that, if we come back to an earlier topic with the eight extras, that's maybe why people get drawn to them, because they don't perhaps understand how these other doctors have thought about Chinese medicine. So there's someone presenting them these ideas of like psychology and things like that. So they think, oh, well, this is what Chinese medicine must have always been about, instead of kind of, perhaps understanding these other ideas. Um,
Yeah, I thought that was a good example with the using the Wenbing ideas and the like Sang Juyin and Yin Chao San, because they're often presented. I think the way I learned them here is it's taught to you at the same time as you learn Zhang Zhongjing's idea. One is wind cold, one is wind heat,
yeah,
and
like
and, and
the
there's a
Fajie, right? Fabiao.
yeah, and they're taught at the same time as if they're they're two separate diagnoses that, but these are thousands of years apart, these
Mm,
sorts of ideas, and
mm,
use radically different herbs and all of these sorts of things. And it was never explained to me like that. So
no.
I think that
I
was a
mean,
really good way of looking at it.
I mean, one of the funniest or coolest things, I guess you can view it as well, is that the first formula, I think, in the Wenbing Tiaobian is actually Guizhitang and Bai Hu
Yeah,
Tang.
sure.
So it kind of like, like Wu Tong, he's definitely not saying, hey, you guys don't need the Shanghai Lun, but I'm presenting these other formulas because I'm seeing something different, or this is, what I'm basing it on as well. And he actually, he bases it all on kind of like the Neijing as well. So once again, he's coming back to this idea of theory, kind of like, might you say, like dictating his clinical practice, which then he puts into practical application as well.
Mm.
And that to me is what Chinese medicine is that we live, at least for me, in a paradigm of Chinese medicine, which is kind of yin yang, wuxing, six qi, 12 channels, right? And if you want to kind of like step outside of that, go against the kind of dominant paradigm, then you need to present a very convincing argument as to why. And but for me, that's what I like about these old authors, is that they kind of elaborate on these ideas and they give you new ways of thinking about it. And it's definitely not one line of congruent or coherent thought. Like, for example, you see some authors like Huang Yanyu, and he talks very much about 5 phases as well, and 6 qi. Then you might have like another guy like Chen Yuan, and he's kind of bringing in other ideas like about what you might call how might you call it, like Ben Biao Zhong, like root, branch, and middle qi for the Shanghai Lun as well. So you get to see these different ideas. And what I like is when I talk to people about this, I say, well, it's important to memorize the idea, but what else is important is actually to remember, to kind of think about how did they extrapolate that idea in that context, and can you possibly extrapolate or use that extrapolation process in other ideas to enhance your understanding in different cases as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that kind of like I remember having a conversation with a good friend called Ivan Zavala, or Cloud, and we're actually going to be teaching a little bit of class on diagnostics, mostly aimed at South American people. But he was kind of the one who really pointed that out to me, is that like, you just don't think about what the person said, but think about their method of thinking as well, and try to understand that and use that idea, or try and use that form of extrapolation in different areas.
Oh, it's good advice.
Yeah.
On that note, we might leave it there, but thanks for your time, Michael. And yeah, it was a fantastic discussion. I really enjoyed it.
No worries. It's just look, honestly, I was really, really bummed. We were supposed to catch up last year at the conference, but because you were presenting last year, I believe. So was I.
Oh yeah, they were gonna fly me to Brisbane, and I'm glad they cancelled it, because I would have been stuck there or something.
Well, no, not this year, but last year.
Oh, last year.
I think
that's right.
Were you on the Gold Coast? And anyway, I was really disappointed that we didn't get to catch up, because we always have a really good time when we catch up. Like, I still remember when we went to that what was the Chinese shop in Melbourne where we had that soup or something like that?
I think it was a Xinjiang restaurant, wasn't it?
Was it?
Or maybe
that was La Mian. We went
La Mian. Oh, okay.
We went for that place, but then we went to another place with my wife as well. That was it, like Singaporean or something like that?
I think so. Something like that.
And I think they had those little eggs or something like that. But anyway, it was
we eat well.
yeah. But I want to just give a real big shout out to Alan Saw, my editor. Like, I call him the reverse garbage compactor, because I give him garbage and it comes out looking like something good. Obviously to Johan, these books would never have existed without him. And my other friends, Will Servils, who were working together, and Ivan Zavala and Corey Dillo. These guys are all my kind of Chinese medicine buddies, and I find it really useful to have someone that you can talk about Chinese medicine with as well, and kind of bounce your ideas off. And they're a little bit like the meat grinder, where if you put something through, they'll try and attack you, because you basically want your ideas to be of a high standard. And if you can't defend them, then what are you doing putting your ideas out there in the public realm when they haven't been properly defended? Just like a thesis defense. And finally, I would say thank you for having me, Daniel. I really, really enjoyed the podcast and everything that you're doing for Chinese medicine as well.
I appreciate that, Michael. And thanks for your time today.
No problems. All right. Have a lovely Sunday.
And I'd once again like to thank Michael for taking the time out today to talk to us. And once again, the book is available through Purple Cloud Press and can be ordered on our website, www.purplecloudinstitute.com. And I would highly recommend it for anyone looking to expand their knowledge of acupuncture. And on that note, I'll leave it there. Bye for now. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.